Rose Whitcomb, at 27, was a seamstress who knew her place. It was usually a corner, a back room, or the space just beside a door, where she could be summoned or dismissed without ceremony. But the will of the woman who had kept her there was about to give her a home, and a war to keep it. The rancher watching from the corner of the room, ashamed of his own kin, had not yet decided what he would do. But the quiet life they would build was already taking root in the silence after the last line was read. Stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The summons had found her in the small room she rented above the mercantile, a space that always smelled of dust and dried beans. Rose was told to present herself at the Hale Ranch at 2 o'clock. No reason was given, but she knew. Eleanor Hale had been buried 2 days prior, and the family was now attending to the business of her departure. Rose had sewn Eleanor's burial dress, a fine black silk that had been an agony to work with, the fabric resisting the needle at every turn. It felt fitting. Now she stood in the Hale parlor, a room she had only ever entered to take measurements or deliver finished garments. It was a place of dark, heavy furniture and thicker silence. The air was tight with held breaths and the scent of lemon oil and old grief. Rose kept her hands folded at her waist, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond the shoulder of Edward Bishop, Eleanor's brother. He was a man whose softness had curdled into spite, his face florid with the importance of the moment. His wife, Beatrice, sat beside him, a bird-like woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing and forgave less. They, along with 2 distant cousins, were the primary mourners. And then there was Thomas Hale, Eleanor's husband, who stood apart from the group, near the cold fireplace, his expression unreadable. He had not looked at her when she entered. Rose was accustomed to being overlooked by him. In all her years of service to his wife, he had offered her little more than a curt nod. She expected no different today. "We are gathered," Edward began, his voice taking on a preacher's cadence, "to execute the final will and testament of my beloved sister, Eleanor Hale, née Bishop." He unfolded the papers with a flourish. Rose felt a familiar tension settle in her shoulders. She knew why she was here. It was part of the performance. Eleanor had enjoyed these small cruelties, these reminders of station. Rose would be given a pittance, a silver dollar, perhaps, as a final, public dismissal. A thank you for service that was meant to feel like an insult. She was prepared for it. She had learned long ago to build a stillness inside herself, a place where their condescension could not reach. Edward read through the initial bequests. Land to the cousins. Stocks and bonds to Beatrice. He paused for dramatic effect. To my own person, he read, a smug smile touching his lips. My sister has left the entirety of her shares in the Bishop Mercantile and a significant portion of the Hale cattle stock, to be managed by me in perpetuity. Beatrice's hand went to his arm, a gesture of proud possession. Then, Edward's eyes found Rose, standing by the door. The performance was about to reach its climax. And lastly, he said, his voice lifting so all could hear, for the seamstress, Rose Whitcomb, a woman whose services my sister employed from time to time, he let the words hang, a deliberate emphasis on her status as hired help. Rose kept her chin level. She would not give them the satisfaction of a flinch. He cleared his throat to read the final line. And then his voice faltered. He stopped. He read the line again to himself, his lips moving silently. The florid color drained from his face. "What is it, Edward?" Beatrice chirped, impatient. He looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief and fury. He stared at Rose as if she had just pulled a gun. This is preposterous. It's a mistake." Thomas Hale finally moved from his place by the fireplace. "Read what it says, Edward." His voice was low and steady, a gravelly sound that cut through the tension. Edward's hand trembled, the paper rattling. He swallowed hard and read, his voice a strangled whisper. "To Rose Whitcomb, I leave the Hale homestead and the house upon it, the remaining third of my personal cattle holdings, and legal guardianship of my ward and niece, Clara done, until she comes of age. It is my final wish that she be raised in that house, by that woman, who has shown her more kindness in secret than I ever did in public." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the furniture, colder than the empty hearth. Every eye in the room was on Rose. In that moment, she was no longer invisible. She was the enemy. Beatrice let out a sound like a kettle coming to a boil, a thin, rising shriek of indignation. But Rose did not look at her. She looked at the small, pale face of 10-year-old Clara, who was peeking from behind a heavy curtain, her eyes filled with a terrifying hope. Rose's carefully constructed stillness fractured, not from the shock of the inheritance, but from the weight of that child's gaze. Thomas Hale watched the scene unfold from the periphery, a place he had long grown accustomed to occupying within his own home. He had stood by the mantel, a silent witness, feeling a familiar, sour shame curdle in his gut. He knew his in-laws. He knew their petty cruelties, their obsession with station and appearance. He had expected Edward to make a show of dismissing the seamstress, and he had braced himself for the quiet ugliness of it. A final, graceless act in his late wife's name. He had not expected this. He saw the blood drain from Edward's face, the pure, unadulterated venom that replaced it. He heard Beatrice's hiss of outrage. But his attention was not on them. It was on Rose Whitcomb. He had seen her come and go for years, a quiet, almost translucent presence in the house. She was always neat, her brown hair pulled back severely, her hands always occupied with a pincushion or a length of fabric. He had noted her, the way a man notes a fence post or a gate, as a functional part of the landscape. He had never truly seen her. Now, he did. He saw the way she stood, her back ramrod straight, as Edward's voice had dripped with condescension. She hadn't bowed her head. She hadn't shuffled her feet. She had simply stood there and taken it. Her stillness a shield. And when the final line was read, when the impossible bequest landed in the center of the room like a lit stick of dynamite, her composure had barely wavered. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Not triumph, not greed, but a deep, profound shock that she seemed to be holding at bay through sheer force of will. He saw her hands, clasped at her waist, tighten until the knuckles were white. He followed her gaze and saw the small form of his niece, Clara, hiding behind the damask curtains. He'd almost forgotten the girl was in the room. Under Eleanor's care, Clara had become as silent and unobtrusive as a mouse, a small, sad shadow in a house that had little warmth to spare. Now, the child's face was alight with a desperate, pleading hope. It was all directed at Rose. The will's final words echoed in his mind, "Who has shown her more kindness in secret than I ever did in public." He had missed it. All of it. The secret kindnesses, the quiet bond that had formed between the overlooked seamstress and the forgotten child. A fresh wave of shame washed over him, sharper this time. He had been so consumed by his own quiet grief, by the slow, grinding duty of his marriage to Eleanor, that he had failed to see what was happening under his own roof. This is an outrage. Beatrice was on her feet now, her voice shrill. She manipulated her, a dying woman. She wormed her way in, the conniving little "That's enough, Beatrice," Thomas said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through her tirade like a sharp blade. The room fell silent again. Edward turned on him. "You cannot possibly let this stand, Thomas. She's a servant. This house, this land, it belongs to the family." He waved the will as if to strike Rose with it. "She will be out of this house by nightfall." Thomas looked from Edward's furious, contorted face to Rose's pale, composed one. He saw the slight tremble in her hands, the only sign of the strain she was under. He saw Clara, who had shrunk back behind the curtain, her hope dissolving into fear. In that moment, a decision that had been unformed, a vague impulse of decency, solidified into something hard and clear. He was the master of this ranch. This was his land. And the cruelty of his wife's family would not be the final word in his house. Not today. He knew what he had to do. It was not a grand gesture of romance or rescue. It was a simple, practical matter of righting a balance. He had been a bystander in his own life for too long. The air in the parlor was thick with Edward's fury. He took a step toward Rose, his finger jabbing in her direction. You will gather your things, your one pathetic bag, and you will be gone. The law will see this corrected, but you will not spend one night under Eleanor's roof. His words were a physical force, meant to shove her out the door and back into the insignificance from which she had, in his eyes, so audaciously emerged. Beatrice stood beside him, a pillar of righteous indignation, her arms crossed tightly. Rose did not move. She met Edward's glare without blinking, though Thomas could see the effort it cost her. She looked terribly alone, a small, unmovable object in the path of a storm. Clara had begun to cry softly behind the curtain, a sound that pricked at the edges of the room's hostility. It was that sound that finally spurred Thomas to action. He moved from the fireplace, crossing the room in 3 long strides. He didn't place himself in front of Rose like a shield, but beside her, a subtle shift in alignment that changed the entire geometry of the room. He was no longer a neutral observer. He was on her side. She's not going anywhere, Edward, Thomas said, his voice as quiet and firm as before. Edward sputtered. Thomas, have you lost your senses? This is a Hale house. She has no claim here. The will says she does, Thomas stated plainly. He wasn't arguing the point, he was stating a fact. And the will is what the law will follow, once the circuit judge gets here. Until then, this is my ranch, and I say she stays. Beatrice scoffed. And where is she to stay? In Eleanor's bedroom? The audacity. Thomas ignored her. He turned his head slightly to address Rose directly, his voice dropping to a more personal, practical register. He's right about one thing. You can't stay in this house tonight. Not with them in it. He looked past her, out the window, his gaze settling on a small, weathered structure a few hundred yards from the main house. The old foreman's cabin is empty. It's clean. There's a good stove. He brought his eyes back to hers. For the first time, he was speaking to her not as a rancher to a seamstress, but as one person to another, assessing a problem and finding a solution. You can stay there, Miss Whitcomb. You and the girl. It has its own door and a solid lock. No one will bother you. I'll see to it. The offer was plain, unornamented. There was no pity in his voice, no charity. It was a practical arrangement, a temporary shelter from the storm. He was offering her a defensible space, a patch of ground where she could stand until the legalities were sorted. He wasn't offering to save her, only to give her the means to save herself. Rose took his measure. She looked into his steady gray eyes and saw not a white knight, but something far more valuable. A reliable man making a sensible offer. She had been on her own for so long, navigating the world with nothing but her needle and her spine. She knew the difference between a kind gesture and a binding one. This offer asked nothing of her but acceptance. She gave a single, decisive nod. Thank you, Mr. Hale. Her voice was low but clear, without a trace of the tremor he'd seen in her hands. I'll have one of the hands take your things over, he said, already turning to leave. There's no need, Rose replied, her voice stopping him. I only have the one bag. She looked toward the hall where her sewing basket sat by the door. It contained everything she owned in the world. Thomas nodded. He walked to the hall, picked up the heavy wicker basket, and turned back. Clara, he called, his voice gentle. Go with Miss Whitcomb. The girl darted from behind the curtains and ran to Rose's side, her small hand immediately finding Rose's. The sight of it, the instantaneous, trusting connection, silenced whatever retort Edward had been forming. Thomas held the door open, the sewing basket in one hand, and gestured for them to pass. As Rose stepped over the threshold, out of the suffocating parlor, and into the clean, cold air. She felt the weight of the house fall away, replaced by the small, warm pressure of a child's hand in hers. The foreman's cabin was exactly as Thomas Hale had described it, spare, clean, and orderly. A single room held a narrow iron cot, a small pot-bellied stove, a dry sink with a pitcher and basin, and a sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs. A stack of freshly split pine was piled neatly beside the stove, and the water in the pitcher was cool and fresh. Everything spoke of a quiet, unassuming competence. It was a man's space, built for purpose, not for comfort, yet Rose found a strange comfort in its lack of pretense. It was honest. Thomas set her sewing basket down just inside the door. He did not linger. "The hands know you're to be here on my authority," he said, his gaze sweeping the room to ensure nothing was amiss. "They won't trouble you. The lock is new." He gestured to the shiny brass bolt on the inside of the door. He then looked at Clara, who was still holding tightly to Rose's hand. "Clara, you mind Miss Whitcomb. She's in charge of you now." It was a simple declaration, reinforcing the will's decree with his own authority. The girl nodded, her eyes wide. He met Rose's gaze one last time. "There's smoked ham and beans in the main house pantry. Help yourself to whatever you need for supper. Beatrice and Edward are leaving on the morning coach." He stated it as a fact, not a hope. He would see to it. With a final, almost imperceptible nod, he was gone, pulling the door closed behind him and leaving them in the quiet solitude of the small cabin. For a long moment, Rose and Clara just stood there, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind against the eaves. Then, Rose let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She gently squeezed Clara's hand. "Well," she said, her voice soft, "let's make this place ours for a little while." Her first act was to walk to the sewing basket. She ran her hand over the worn wicker, a familiar, grounding gesture. It had been her mother's, and it held not just thread and shears, but the entire architecture of her life. She lifted the lid, and the familiar scent of beeswax and old linen rose to meet her. She did not unpack it completely, a habit born of a life of temporary lodgings, but she took out a small folded quilt and a clean linen towel. While Clara watched, mesmerized by the novelty of it all, Rose made the cot up with the crisp, clean sheets that had been left folded at its base, topping it with the familiar quilt. She washed her face and hands in the basin, the cold water a bracing shock. She then turned her attention to the stove. She had never lit a pot-bellied stove before, but she had watched others. With the focused precision she applied to a difficult seam, she laid the kindling, struck a match, and coaxed a small flame to life. Soon, a steady, radiating warmth began to push back the encroaching chill of the evening. She left Clara by the fire and walked the short distance to the main house. As promised, the parlor was empty. The lingering scent of Beatrice's outrage was already fading. In the pantry, Rose found the ham and beans, along with a sack of flour, coffee, and a tin of lard. She took only what she needed for one meal, her movements economical and sure. Back in the cabin, she set a pan of beans on the stove to heat and slice the ham. The small room filled with the hearty, comforting smells of supper. As she worked, she felt a slow, unfamiliar peace settle over her. The terms of the arrangement were clear. The space was secure. For the first time in a very long time, she could set down her bag, light a fire, and know she would not be asked to leave before the morning. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm, a language of small, practical acts. Rose was an early riser, a habit ingrained by years of needing to catch the best morning light for her sewing. Before the sun had fully crested the eastern ridge, she would be up, rekindling the fire in the cabin's small stove. On the second morning, when she opened her door to the pale, cold dawn, she found a pail of fresh, still warm milk sitting on the step. There was no note, no one was in sight. She simply brought it inside, strained it, and set it in the coolest corner of the cabin. It happened again the next day, and the day after that. It became a silent, reliable fact of her morning. In return, she began to cook for more than just two. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, of Thomas Hale's long days. She saw him leave at dawn and return after dusk, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went deeper than physical labor. So she started making extra. After she and Clara had eaten, she would walk to the main house, her path lit by the lamp she left burning in the kitchen window. She'd leave a plate of food, stew or roasted chicken, or ham and potatoes, warming on the back of the big wood stove, with a clean fork set beside it. She never waited for him. He never mentioned it. But the next morning, the plate was always clean, washed and dried, and set back on the pantry shelf where it belonged. One afternoon, a cold wind kicked up, rattling the cabin's single window. Rose noticed a loose board on her small porch step. It shifted under her weight every time she went in or out. She made a mental note to be careful of it. The next evening, when she returned from the main house kitchen, she saw that the board had been renailed. Flush and firm, two new, shiny nail heads were the only evidence of the repair. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. He had fixed it as quietly as a ghost, addressing a problem without ever needing to name it. Her world, once confined to the four walls of a rented room, expanded to include the cabin, the path to the main house, and the rhythms of the man who owned it all. She saw the mending pile in a basket by the hearth in the big house. Shirts with torn cuffs, trousers with split seams. It had sat there, untouched, since Eleanor's passing. One evening, while waiting for a pot of coffee to brew, she picked up a shirt. The collar was frayed. With a needle and thread from the small kit she now kept in her apron pocket, she began to repair it, her stitches small and even. She worked her way through the pile over the next week, a few pieces at a time. A reinforced button here, a darned elbow there. It was work her hands knew, a quiet way of imposing order on a small corner of chaos. Thomas noticed. He felt the difference in the shirt he pulled on one morning, the cuff no longer catching on his wrist. He saw the neat patch on the knee of his work denims. He came into the kitchen one night, later than usual, chilled to the bone, and found the coffee pot still warm on the stove, a cup set out beside it. He poured a cup, the dark, hot liquid abalm against the cold. The house was no longer just an empty, echoing space he returned to at the end of the day. It was being kept. A subtle warmth was seeping back into its corners, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. He knew its source. He knew it was the quiet, capable woman in the foreman's cabin. But he said nothing. To speak of it would be to break the delicate, unspoken truce they had established. It would be like thanking the sun for rising. It was simply happening, and for now, that was enough. Clara, who had been a pale and silent creature in the grand house, began to bloom in the small cabin. Under her Aunt Eleanor's roof, she had been treated as another piece of fine, fragile furniture to be kept dusted and out of the way. With Rose, she was a participant in their small, shared life. She learned to knead dough for biscuits, her small hands clumsy but determined. She learned to churn butter and to tell by the sound when it was ready. Rose taught her the names of the stitches, running stitch, back stitch, chain stitch, and let her practice on scraps of calico, her brow furrowed in concentration. The girl's trust, once a tiny, flickering ember, grew into a steady flame. She began to follow Rose everywhere, a small, chattering shadow. She brought her treasures found on walks, a smooth river stone, a hawk's feather, a spray of late-blooming Indian paintbrush. Rose would accept each one with a solemn gravity, placing them on the cabin's single windowsill until it became a curated line of Clara's discoveries. The constant, low-grade fear that had pinched the corners of the girl's eyes began to recede, replaced by an open, trusting curiosity. The ranch hands, a rough and reserved bunch, began to thaw as well. They had initially regarded Rose with a wary distance, another complication in the strange drama of the Hale household. But they saw her quiet industry. They saw the way Clara, a child they had only ever seen as a ghost in a window, was now laughing as she helped Rose hang laundry on the line. One of the younger hands, a boy named Will, took a bad gash to his forearm from a slip of a branding iron. He came to the main house, bleeding and stoic. Thomas was out in the far pasture. Rose took one look at the wound, her face calm, and went to her sewing basket. She returned not with mending thread, but with a clean cloth, a bottle of carbolic she found in the pantry, and a fine, curved needle. She cleaned and stitched the wound with a surgeon's precision, her movements deft and sure. The boy barely flinched. From then on, the men's deference held a new note of respect. They started calling her Miss Rose. They left offerings on her porch step, alongside the pail of milk, a string of fresh-caught trout, a brace of quail, a sack of wild pecans. She was useful, and on the frontier, usefulness was a form of currency more valuable than coin. The turning point, the moment that crystallized the change in the household, came on a Tuesday evening. A storm was rolling in, the sky a bruised purple. Rose was in the main kitchen, hurrying to get a loaf of bread out of the oven. Clara was at the big wooden table, ostensibly drying the supper dishes, but mostly just making patterns in the soapy water. "Hurry now, Clara," Rose said gently. "The storm will be on us soon." Clara looked up, her face serious. "Can I help you get the bread out, Mama?" The word landed in the quiet kitchen with the force of a dropped stone. Mama. It was not a question. It was a statement, a simple naming of a thing that in the child's heart had already become true. Rose went utterly still, her hands hovering over the hot oven door. She had been a seamstress, a servant, Miss Whitcomb. She had never, in her wildest imaginings, been a mother. At that exact moment, Thomas Hale pushed open the back door, bringing a gust of cold rain-scented air with him. He stopped on the threshold, having heard the single, transformative word. He looked at Rose's frozen posture, at the back of her head. He looked at Clara, who was watching Rose with an anxious, hopeful expression. He saw the entire shape of their new reality laid bare in that one small word. He didn't say anything. He just quietly closed the door, hung his wet hat on its peg, and waited, giving the woman who was not yet his wife the space to answer the child who was not yet her daughter. Rose finally turned, a slow, dazed movement, and knelt before Clara. She didn't speak, but she gathered the little girl into her arms, and it was answer enough. The quiet arrangement of their lives, built on a foundation of unspoken acts, began to shift after that. The word Mama, once spoken, could not be unheard. It settled into the spaces between them, a gentle but persistent pressure. Thomas found himself lingering in the kitchen in the evenings, cleaning a piece of tack or mending a bridle. The simple act of sharing the warm, lamplit space with Rose and Clara becoming a necessary part of his day. One night, a week after the storm, exhaustion finally caught up with Rose. The circuit judge had been delayed, and the legal limbo of her inheritance stretched on. She had spent the day turning the collar on one of Thomas's good shirts, a task requiring intense focus, while also keeping Clara occupied and managing the cooking for the entire ranch, as their usual cook was down with a fever. After putting a sleeping Clara to bed in the cabin, she had returned to the main house to finish her mending by the fire. Thomas was there, sitting in his usual chair, reading a week-old newspaper. The steady crackle of the fire and the rhythmic click of her needle were the only sounds. Slowly, without her noticing, the rhythm of her sewing faltered. Her head, heavy with sleep, drooped, coming to rest against the worn wing of the armchair. Her hands went still in her lap, the unfinished shirt lying across them. Thomas lowered his paper. He watched her for a long moment, the firelight softening the tired lines around her eyes. He saw the strength in the set of her jaw, even in sleep. He felt a powerful, protective urge, something deeper and more potent than the sense of duty that had first prompted him to help her. He rose quietly from his chair, went to a nearby chest, and took out a thick wool blanket. With immense care, so as not to wake her, he draped it over her shoulders, tucking it gently around her. He added another log to the fire, banking it to burn low and long through the night. Then, he simply sat back down in his chair and kept watch, guarding her sleep. He left before dawn, before she woke, leaving the blanket as the only evidence he had been there. The next afternoon, he found her in the cabin, not sewing, but staring at a small, framed piece of embroidery from her basket. It was a sampler, exquisitely stitched but yellowed with age, showing a field of bluebonnets. He leaned against the doorframe, the first time he had ever lingered at her private threshold. "That's fine work," he said, his voice quiet. Rose startled, her head coming up. "My mother made it," she said, her voice soft. "It's all I have of hers." He took a step into the room, his presence filling the small space. "Where did you learn to sew like that?" "From her?" It was the first time he, or anyone, had ever asked about her past. They asked for her skill, for her time, for her labor. They never asked for her story. The question undid a knot deep inside her. "She taught me the basics," Rose found herself saying, her gaze distant. "But she died when I was young. I mostly learned from books, and from unpicking the stitches of fine dresses to see how they were made. I wanted to understand the structure of things." He nodded slowly, his eyes on her face. He was not just hearing her words, he was listening. He was seeing the girl she had been, alone, reverse engineering a life for herself one stitch at a time. "The structure of things," he repeated, as if tasting the words. It explained everything about her. Her quiet competence, her methodical way of fixing what was broken. A new awareness grew between them after that. The small acts of care, once purely practical, now felt charged with unspoken meaning. When he left the pail of milk, his hand lingered for a moment on the cool metal. When she left his supper on the stove, she took extra care to arrange the food on the plate. They had cracked the surface of their arrangement, and something deeper, more personal, was beginning to seep through. He knew what this was. He had known, on some level, for some time. But he, a man of patience and slow decisions, was content to let it grow in the quiet, to see what shape it would take. Just as a fragile warmth began to settle over the Hale Ranch, a cold front blew in from town. Its source was Beatrice Bishop. Having been summarily dismissed from the ranch, she had taken up residence in town, nursing her grievance like a precious, bitter tea. She began to talk. She spoke on the steps of the church, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. She held court in the aisle of the general store, her tone a careful mixture of feigned concern and sharp-edged slander. "It's a terrible shame what's become of the Hale place," she would say to Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife. "That woman, living out there. In the foreman's cabin, they say. On his property, with poor little Clara as her shield. It's not respectable." She would let the words hang, allowing the listener's imagination to do the rest of the work. She painted a picture of Rose as a cunning opportunist, a woman of loose morals who had taken advantage of a grieving widow and was now sinking her claws into the widower himself. She hinted that the will was a forgery, or the product of a deluded, dying mind, manipulated by a servant with ambition. The poison worked its way through the small community. Prosperity, Texas, was a place that valued propriety above all else. The story was too scandalous, too interesting to ignore. The warmth that had been building around Rose began to pull back like water before a frost. Mrs. Gable, who had nodded cordially to Rose just a week before, now looked straight through her when they passed on the street. Mr. Henderson, the store clerk, who had started saving Rose the best cuts of bacon, became brusque and short, tallying her purchases with a judgmental air. The invitations to church socials, which had just begun to be tentatively extended, stopped entirely. Rose felt the chill immediately. It was a familiar cold, one she had known most of her life. The suspicion in people's eyes, the sudden silences when she entered a room. Her instinct, honed over years of self-preservation, was to withdraw. She did not defend herself. To do so would be to give the rumors credence, to engage in a battle she could not win. Who would believe a nameless seamstress over the sister of the late Mrs. Hale? So she pulled in, her world shrinking back to the cabin, the kitchen, and the small, trusting face of Clara. Her spine remained straight, her chin level, but a quiet, weary sadness settled in her eyes. Thomas saw it all. He heard the whispers when he went to town for supplies. He felt the shift in atmosphere, the way men who had clapped him on the shoulder now offered only a curt nod. His anger was a slow, hot burn, directed not at the town, but at the casual cruelty of Beatrice and Edward. One Saturday, he drove the wagon into town for grain. While the feed store owner was loading his sacks, Thomas walked across the street to the general store. The place was crowded. Beatrice was there, near the front counter, speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone to two other women. As Thomas entered, the conversation stopped. A palpable silence fell over the store. Mr. Henderson, behind the counter, looked nervous. Thomas paid him no mind. He walked calmly through the store, gathering what he needed: flour, sugar, coffee, a bag of peppermint candies for Clara. He placed his items on the counter. Henderson tallied them up, his movements stiff. "That'll be $4.50, Mr. Hale," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas counted out the money. Then, as Henderson began to bag the goods, he pushed another large sack of flour and a 5-pound bag of sugar forward. "And these too," he said. Henderson looked confused. "You already have flour and sugar, Mr. Hale." Thomas looked directly at him, his gray eyes steady and unblinking. His voice was not loud, but it was clear and carried to every corner of the silent store. "These are for Miss Whitcomb," he said. "Please add them to my bill." He stood there, waiting, his presence a solid, unmovable fact. He was not just buying supplies, he was making a public statement. He was drawing a line in the sand. He did not believe the gossip. He was providing for her, openly and without shame. Beatrice, standing by the bulk goods, went rigid, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. She had been publicly countered, not with an argument, but with a simple, undeniable act of loyalty. Thomas picked up his bags, gave a general nod to the room, and walked out, leaving the weight of his decision hanging in the air behind him. The standoff came to a head on a bright, cold morning in late October. The leaves of the cottonwoods had turned a brittle yellow, and the air held the sharp promise of winter. Rose was on the porch of the main house, showing Clara how to mend a tear in her apron, when a buggy rattled up the long drive. It was not a vehicle she recognized. 2 men sat on the seat: the county sheriff, a man named Patterson whose face was set in lines of weary duty, and Edward Bishop. Edward's face was a mask of grim triumph. He swung himself down from the buggy before it had even fully stopped, a sheaf of papers held in his hand like a weapon. He did not bother with greetings. He marched directly to the foot of the porch steps, his eyes fixed on Rose. "This is over," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "I have a court order." He held up the papers, waving them for emphasis. "From the circuit judge. He has reviewed the case and found the terms of the will regarding this property irregular. He has placed the house and all assets in temporary receivership, pending a full hearing next spring." Sheriff Patterson climbed down more slowly, his discomfort plain. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, his voice apologetic. "I'm afraid he's right. The order requires you to vacate the main house. You can remain in the foreman's cabin, as an employee of the estate, but you can't live here." Edward's smile was venomous. "You heard him. Get out of Eleanor's house. It is a Hale house, and you have no right to it." He took a step up onto the porch, his intention clear. He meant to physically remove her. Rose instinctively pulled Clara behind her, her body shielding the child. She did not speak, did not argue. She simply stood her ground, her face pale but resolute, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. From the direction of the south pasture, a horse and rider appeared, moving not at a gallop, but at a steady, ground-eating canter. It was Thomas. He had seen the buggy from a distance. He rode directly to the house, dismounting in a single fluid motion. He did not run. He walked with a deliberate calm up the porch steps and came to a stop directly beside Rose. He didn't look at Edward. He didn't look at the papers. He looked at the sheriff. "Patterson," he said, his voice low and even, "is this your idea of keeping the peace?" The sheriff had the grace to look ashamed. "I have an order, Thomas. My hands are tied. An order to evict a woman and a child with winter coming on, based on a preliminary hearing she wasn't even invited to attend." Thomas's voice was still quiet, but it had an edge of cold steel. He turned his gaze to his brother-in-law. Edward flinched, but held up his papers again. "The law is on my side, Thomas. This is my family's legacy." "This is my ranch," Thomas countered, his voice dropping even lower. "And this is her home." "That will is going to be upheld, Edward. I'll spend every last dollar I have to see that it is." "You will gain nothing from this but lawyers' fees and the satisfaction of being a cruel man. Now get off my porch." Edward, faced with the cold, unyielding certainty in Thomas's eyes, saw that he had lost. This was not a fight he could win, not against Thomas Hale on his own land. His triumphant posture crumpled. Muttering under his breath, he stalked back to the buggy, defeated. The sheriff tipped his hat. "I'm sorry for the trouble, Miss Rose." "Thomas," he turned and climbed back into his seat, leaving them standing on the porch. As the buggy rattled away, Thomas finally turned to Rose. The ranch hands, who had gathered at a respectful distance, began to disperse, but the moment still felt intensely public. He looked at her, at the fierce, protective way she still held on to Clara, at the exhaustion and fear she was trying so hard to conceal. In a low voice, meant only for her, he said, "He's right about one thing." Rose looked up at him. Confused, "It should be a Hale house," he said, his eyes holding hers. "Marry me, Rose, not for the ranch, not for Clara, for me. Stay with me." The proposal was as plain and sturdy as the man who delivered it. It was not born of pity or convenience, but of a deep, quiet recognition that had grown between them in the silent language of kept suppers and mended fences. It was an offer not of shelter, but of partnership. She looked at his steady face, at the truth in his eyes, and saw a future she had never dared to imagine. A home. A place to finally set down her basket and not have to keep it packed. Her answer was as simple and true as his question. "Yes," she whispered. Yes, they were married 3 days later on the steps of the small clapboard church in town. It was a simple ceremony, officiated by the traveling minister who passed through Prosperity once a month. Rose wore her best dress, a simple dark wool she had made herself, and for the first time, she pinned a small cluster of dried wildflowers into her hair. Thomas stood beside her, solid and sure in his Sunday suit. Clara, holding both their hands, stood between them, her face shining. More people attended than Rose had expected. The ranch hands stood in a rough, respectful line at the back. Mr. Henderson from the general store was there, as was Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, who gave Rose a small, hesitant smile that was as close to an apology as she would ever get. The town, having witnessed Thomas's unwavering public support, had quietly, decisively come down on his side. Beatrice and Edward Bishop were, conspicuously, not in attendance. Their absence was its own kind of closing statement. Seasons turned. The raw, windswept autumn gave way to the deep, still cold of winter, and then melted into the vibrant green of a Texas spring. The legal challenges from Edward faded into nothing, his threats proving as empty as his character. The Hale Ranch settled into a new, quiet rhythm. The foreman's cabin now stood empty. Rose had moved into the main house, and with her she had brought a warmth and life that the high-ceilinged rooms had never known. One evening, as the last of the spring sunlight slanted through the parlor window, Rose sat in a comfortable chair by the fire, a piece of mending in her lap. Thomas was across from her, cleaning a rifle, while Clara sketched in a notebook on the hearthrug between them. The house was filled with the comfortable sounds of a family at peace, the soft scratch of charcoal on paper, the rhythmic click of a cleaning rod, the whisper of thread through cloth. On a small table beside Rose's chair, bathed in the golden light, sat her mother's sewing basket. It was open, its contents no longer packed tight for a quick departure, but spilling out in a cheerful, disorderly array. Spools of colored thread, a silver thimble, swatches of calico and silk, all lay exposed and at ease. The basket, once the symbol of her transient, uncertain life, had found its permanent place. It was no longer a vessel of necessity, packed and ready to flee. It was an heirloom, at rest in its own home. The gossip in town had long since fallen silent, replaced by a grudging, then genuine, respect. Rose was no longer the scandalous seamstress. She was Mrs. Hale, a woman known for her capable hands, her quiet strength, and the fierce love she showed her daughter. She had arrived in that parlor with nothing but a needle and a spine, braced for humiliation. Now, sitting in the warm heart of the house that was unequivocally hers, surrounded by the people who were unequivocally hers, she understood. She had stopped being merely useful, a service to be employed and dismissed. She was, finally and completely, home.